The US is calling it D-Day for Tehran. It says it wants nothing less than the economic asphyxiation of Iran, and it's warning that no country or company should expect to be spared.
Every country, every entity should know that they should be prepared to face US sanctions. And no one is above this. We are going to hold everyone accountable, and this is economic asphyxiation of this regime.
The US has declared a new raft of sanctions aimed at upping the pressure on Iran. They're targeting more than 60 entities, individuals and vessels. That is so they can go after the supply chains that Iran uses to buy the parts, the materials and the technology to build nuclear weapons. The US is also targeting digital assets, gold and aviation to cut off Iran's alternative financial lifelines and to close off loops used to get around sanctions. But there's a problem, and that is China. China normally buys around 80% of Iran's shipped oil. Fresh Iranian exports through the Strait of Hormuz have now largely been choked off, leaving China buying oil from Iran that had already made it out and was sitting in Asian waters. That income provides Tehran with a crucial economic lifeline. And while the US has sanctioned some independent Chinese refineries that purchase Iranian crude, it has stopped short of targeting the major Chinese banks and the financial institutions that help facilitate that trade. So how far is Washington prepared to take its sanctions? Scott Bessent warned that countries violating the sanctions could be shut out of the dollar-based economic system, and he warned more sanctions are coming.
We are giving everyone the opportunity to remedy bad behavior. Why would I want to blow up the global financial system? We believe that it is important to level set and give people a cure period, but they should know that that will move very quickly and that we are serious. Secondary sanctions are a very powerful tool.
Beijing is already pushing back, saying its economic ties with Iran are lawful and warning that it will defend its interests.
Cooperation between China and Iran has always been conducted within the framework of international law and should not be interfered with or disrupted. China is paying close attention to relevant developments and will take all necessary measures to firmly safeguard its own rights and interests.
So there's the dilemma. Washington says nobody is exempt and that much tougher sanctions are coming. But because China buys most of Iran's exported oil, the US would need to really go after China to make Iran feel the pain. Yet, Bessent says he doesn't want to blow up the global financial system. So how far can the US go against Iran without taking on China? Ahmed Abdou is going to help us answer that question and more. He works at the Chatham House think tank in London, where he focuses on China's rising influence in the Middle East and North Africa, on Gulf geopolitics and on US-China competition. Ahmed, thanks so much for being here. China is the key customer for Iranian oil. Can the United States seriously cripple Iran's economy without substantially reducing Chinese purchases of Iranian crude?
The short answer is I don't think so. I think one of the main conditions, if you want to really suffocate the Iranian economy, is to cut the lifeline that China represents through the purchases of between 80 to 90% of all Iranian exports of oil. The dilemma here is that the majority of this oil goes to something called independent refineries, or teapot refineries in Shandong province in China, which are responsible for refining 25% of all oil in China. And these refineries depend on the profit margins that sanctioned oil coming from Iran, but also Russia and previously Venezuela, allow them to continue in the market and compete with the large NOCs. Now, the problem is for these refineries is that the Trump administration decided to resume its maritime blockade on Iran on the 13th of July. That meant for these refineries that less Iranian oil is reaching Chinese shores, and also that all the oil that was on the tanks opposite to the shores of China have dried up, meaning that the prices of Iranian oil is now spiking up, pressuring the margin very much. So the problem here is, in my view, for these refineries is the maritime blockade more than the sanctions.
The Treasury Department, if I'm correct, has sanctioned smaller Chinese refiners, but it hasn't sanctioned major banks. Now, is that because Washington doesn't want to escalate with Beijing, or is that because it thinks that pressuring Iran in other ways will work?
The issue here for the Trump administration is in the payment network system is that it is focused on the provincial banks. These are regional banks that are shielded from the dollar system. They are not exposed to it. And also the payment of Iranian oil goes through the USD chat system in Hong Kong, where the American officials don't have great visibility. The big state-owned banks ditched Iran in 2018 after the first Trump administration imposed the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, because they are exposed to the dollar system and they are well connected to the world economy. They also represent, from Beijing's point of view, a critical point, and they will represent, if they are targeted, a time for China to retaliate against the United States more forcibly. That's why I think the Trump administration were deliberate to avoid sanctioning these banks, and I think unlikely they will in any near future movement.
I mean, Scott Bessent has said very clearly no one is above US sanctions. He's also said very clearly he doesn't want to blow up the global financial system. So what do you think of those two statements? I mean, are those two goals compatible?
No, they're not, because, as I said before, the big banks are not exposed to any transactions that are related to Iran's oil sales. In other words, China's exposure and risk to the global economy are inversely related. China is the most exposed in the least important institutions, that is the provincial banks, and it is least exposed in the most important institutions, that is the big state-owned banks. So targeting these banks will not have any meaningful impact on the oil trade with Iran, unless the United States wants to resume trade and economic war with China.
The Chinese president is expected to meet Donald Trump next month. Is Iranian oil something that Trump can realistically bargain over with President Xi? And what do you think Beijing would potentially want in return?
I think, yes, most definitely, this will be on the table. They will speak about it, as they did in the Beijing summit. But I don't think the Trump administration thinks that Iran worth resuming the trade war again with China. We could see that in the formulation of these sanctions. They are limited on details, on timelines, and on implementation, and even on the punitive measures that the administration would be ready to take against China. So this gives President Trump a lot of space to maneuver and even to implement all these decisions against China. And I don't think they will want to do that before the summit, and also in the run-up to the midterm election as well. From a Chinese point of view, I think they think the same. We could see that in the shielding measures that the Chinese government took after the economic fury campaign in May, and Chinese officials came on TV and they said the objective was only to nullify the impact of these measures against our institutions, not to escalate against the United States. So both powers here are under restraint of the summit, especially not only this summit, by the way, but the two leaders will meet again twice after the summit in 2026.
Do you see China potentially being part of a solution here? I mean, would Beijing have interests in regional stability that Washington could then potentially leverage? They could kind of work on that level?
If the Chinese want to find an off-ramp for President Trump, they can, technically, because the independent refineries, which absorb the majority of oil imports from Iran, they don't buy oil at will. They are constrained by quotas every year that are issued by the Chinese government. So what would happen going up to the summit, in my view, if Beijing wants to help, is to reduce the amount of oil that these refineries are allowed to buy from Iran without announcing it. This means low risk for Beijing. Beijing can turn around and say, we didn't comply with the new sanctions, but this is a sovereign decision. And the Trump administration will be a winner here because it will tighten the screw on the Iranian economy, and both of them will go into the room on the 24th of September in a win-win situation. But in my view, I don't think this will happen because Beijing doesn't want to lose its leverage going into the room during the summit.
If you were, from the sort of perspective of the US, if you were advising the White House today, what would your roadmap look like over the next sort of 12 to 24 months? What combination of sanctions, of diplomacy, I don't know, economic incentives would give the best chance of reducing the risk of future conflict or creating the potential of somehow working together?
I think all the tools in the sanctions book and the sanctions toolkit with the Trump administration have been exhausted when it comes to Iran. So the problem here is Iran adopted to this type of sanctions since 2018 going forward. So the Trump administration cannot do anything that can actually compel Iran to come to negotiating table again and to submit to the administration well. Now that's why they went to hurt third-party countries. I see more useful tools in the decision that the United Arab Emirates took to cut all trade and financial ties with Iran, given that it represents 25% of all Iranian trade. I also see more value in the maritime blockade that actually prevented the tankers to reach the Chinese shore in the first place. These will hurt Iran and might also hurt the independent refineries in China because of the spike in prices and because of the competition with the Indians if they want to revert to buy more Russian oil. But I don't see any massive value in sanctions. I actually see that this has great risk in escalating needlessly with China, given that all the trade truce between China and the United States will expire anyway on the 10th of November. So this is the time or the month where the midterm elections will take place. Would the Trump administration be ready to deal with all the economic impact from this if China decides to retaliate forcibly against American institutions in the United States, but also American investors in China? I think this is one of the options that China will have. The other option is going back to use the nuclear weapon or the China's dominance on the supply chain of critical minerals. Will the United States be ready to take the cost, given that the ammunition stocks are running out and they are increasingly dependent on Chinese supply chain? I don't think so. That's why I think there is more value on the maritime blockade and working with other countries other than China, but there is no value in escalating with China at the moment.
I mean, ultimately, if China decides it will keep buying Iranian oil, can this economic asphyxiation that Besant has been talking about, can that strategy ever work?
No, it will not. And you are now talking about a scenario where there is no maritime pressure on Iran. If Iran manages somehow to let its tankers pass this blockade, I think China will absorb this oil, and the independent refineries will be very happy to take it, given the pressure now that is being put on their supply. For example, there are numbers now that the orders or the offers coming from Iran to these refineries have plummeted for the delivery in September and October compared to the deals in July and August. So the pressure is not biting now in China, but it will bite starting from next month. So again, I will go back to the maritime blockade, and I think preventing these barrels from arriving to China in the first place is a more effective strategy.
Ahmed Aboudu at the Chatham House think tank in London. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Anya, for having me.
So what do you think? Can the United States really cripple Iran's economy without taking on China? Or is Beijing the one player that Washington ultimately cannot afford to confront? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.